During World War II, the war crimes committed by the warring powers left an indelible mark on history. While atrocities such as the systematic genocide of the Holocaust and the massive reprisals by the Soviet Union are well documented, there is a deeply disturbing aspect that for decades has remained in the shadows: the mass and systematic sexual abuses perpetrated by all the major powers involved. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States, responsible for some of the most well-known atrocities, also shared a dark common practice: the sexual exploitation of women, both on the battlefield and in occupied territories. These women, trapped in an environment of extreme violence, were not only victims of physical abuse but were stripped of their humanity in a way that undermined their identities and will to fight. Across all sides, sexual abuse was a tool of control, humiliation, and destruction. The testimonies of those who survived these experiences reveal a truth that is hard to face. In the chaos and barbarity of war, sexual violence was used as a means to break people, a wound that endures even beyond the end of the conflict. How far did human cruelty go in this regard? The silenced hell, sexual violence and repression in the rise of Nazism. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler rose to power, Nazi Germany began a period of unparalleled darkness. Under Hitler's leadership, the Nazi Party implemented an ideology of extreme hatred that sought racial purity and the extermination of those considered enemies of the state. One of the first and most macabre projects of the regime was the construction of concentration camps. Initially intended to house political opponents, these camps soon expanded to accommodate millions of people categorized as undesirable: Jews, Romani, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and prisoners of war, among others. The violence and oppression unleashed in these places became a physical manifestation of the Nazi regime's hatred. The Jewish people in particular suffered one of the most terrifying genocides in human history. In just a few years, over 6 million Jews were murdered in a series of extermination camps and ghettos, using methods that included mass shootings, gas chambers, and forced labor. Violence and brutality became the norm, and the humanity of the victims was systematically erased, transforming them into mere numbers and corpses. For more than a decade, Jewish communities, along with other persecuted groups, were victims of a wave of unchecked hatred, mistreatment, and abuse that left an indelible mark on history. Although the Holocaust is widely documented, one of its darkest and least explored aspects remains the sexual violence inflicted on women. For a long time, this suffering was silenced in historical accounts, overshadowed by the more well-known atrocities such as the extermination camps and mass massacres. However, sexual violence was a constant and brutal reality for many prisoners in the concentration camps. Women in the camps, both Jewish and from other ethnicities and groups, were subjected to systematic sexual violence. Often, the extreme conditions of hunger and suffering were used as a means of control by Nazi officers and guards. The scarcity of food, a resource in short supply in the camps, was used to coerce women. Prisoners, especially women and girls, were forced to have sexual relations in exchange for a food ration, medicine, or some form of temporary relief. The threat of death or torture was constant, and many women found themselves trapped in an impossible choice between surviving through submission or facing certain death. But this violence was not limited to physical exploitation. Women were often used as subjects in Nazi medical experiments, where their bodies were subjected to inhumane practices. These experiments, which included forced sterilizations, pain resistance tests, and other barbaric procedures, aimed not only to destroy their bodies, but also to break their spirits and eliminate any form of resistance. Beyond sexual exploitation, many women endured physical and psychological torture that left permanent scars. Sexual abuse became a tool of humiliation, not only to strip women of their dignity, but also to use their bodies as a means of control and repression. The stories of these women, who fought to survive under impossible conditions, have often been buried beneath the more well-known accounts of the Holocaust, but their voices, though silenced for generations, are now beginning to be heard. Bodies for sale, Himmler, sexual exploitation. Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich and commander-in-chief of the SS, not only orchestrated the brutality and repression within the concentration camps, but also oversaw an aspect of life in those camps that reflects the extreme perversion of the Nazi regime. Himmler, concerned with the physical and psychological well-being of the men under his command, decided to establish brothels both inside and outside the concentration camps. His goal was to keep officers and soldiers satisfied so that they could continue with their work without being distracted by the inherent tensions of war brutality. These brothels were not an exception. They became a dark component of the Nazi control machinery. In places such as Eitz, Tabu, Andal, and Zon, among others, between 300 and 400 women were forced into prostitution. Though the exact number remains uncertain, these women were not volunteers, they were prisoners subjected to a form of sexual slavery under the Nazi regime. There were 3 types of brothels, each intended for a different hierarchy, one for prisoners, another for soldiers, and the most exclusive for SS officers, where the most attractive women were sent. For these prisoners, humiliation was even deeper. They were offered an incentive program that promised rewards in the form of physical contact with soldiers in exchange for higher performance in forced labor. However, this program only reinforced the degradation of these women, who lived under the constant threat of being raped and sexually exploited by the same men they were forced to serve. The most grotesque aspect of this system was the way the Nazis maintained control over their prisoners and the other victims of these brothels. The same racist ideology that dictated the policies of the Nazi regime was reflected in the organization of these places. Jews and people of races considered inferior were prohibited from entering. Most of the women who ended up in these brothels were German, many arrested for prostitution or for being linked to those considered enemies of the Reich. Cynically, the regime that, on one hand, persecuted and punished prostitution had no qualms about turning these women into sexual slaves, forcing them to live under the same conditions as prisoners of war, but with the added element of daily sexual violence. The brothels of the concentration camps not only included German women, but also Spanish prisoners, many of whom were deported after the Spanish Civil War. These women, who had already suffered under Francois repression, were forced into prostitution in a Nazi concentration camp, a painful fate that linked them in suffering with other victims of Nazi brutality. Firmin Caneras, in his work El Barracas Mueren, Las Barracas de las Mujeres, documents with historical precision and a raw approach the life of women subjected to exploitation and abuse in forced brothels. Among the testimonies collected, a chilling account stands out from a Spanish prisoner who exposes the atrocities she suffered during a medical examination imposed by the authorities. In this testimony, the woman describes how she was forced to lie down on a stretcher while her body trembled with fear. She was ordered to spread her legs, and with evident distress, she tried to cover her eyes with her hands, as if that could protect her from the horror of what was about to happen. A cold, metallic instrument was then introduced into her body roughly, causing her sharp pain. Through this procedure, an unknown liquid was injected into her with no explanation as to its purpose. The uncertainty surrounding it was complete. She didn't know if the liquid was poison, an experimental substance, or some form of control designed to keep her under the captor's yoke. The doctor responsible for this procedure, identified as Dr. Ludwig Stumer, acted with total indifference to the prisoner's suffering. According to the account, this man showed no interest in the tears streaming down the woman's face. To him, his work was not about caring for a person, but ensuring that the prisoner's body functioned and fulfilled the goals imposed by the repressive system. Productivity was the absolute priority, and any trace of humanity in the victims was ignored or deliberately crushed. The testimony also notes that, still shocked by the procedure, the prisoner noticed that her hair had not been shaved, a detail that led her to question her fate. While other women were shaved before their execution, she realized she was not going to be killed immediately, but was instead destined for something even more cruel, to be used as an object serving the interests of her oppressors. This testimony, along with others collected by Caneras, reveals in heartbreaking detail the level of dehumanization and cruelty to which these women were subjected. Beyond the physical pain, it is clear that the system sought not only to exploit their bodies, but also to destroy their dignity and sense of humanity. This disturbing testimony reflects not only the physical and sexual brutality inflicted on these women, but also the total indifference and dehumanization that prevailed in Nazi concentration camps. The pain and suffering of these women were not mere collateral consequences of war. They were a systematic tool of control, designed to break their spirits and keep oppression alive. The stories of these women, mostly silenced for decades, are finally beginning to emerge, revealing a chapter of the Holocaust history that still remains misunderstood by many. The price of the liberator, rapes and abuses, during the D-Day invasion. On June 6, 1944, the world witnessed one of the largest and most momentous invasions in history, D-Day, or Operation Overlord. The Allied forces, primarily composed of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and other countries, crossed the English Channel to land in Normandy. This assault marked the beginning of a decisive campaign to liberate northwestern Europe from Nazi occupation, at a high human and material cost. However, among the official narratives of heroism and sacrifice, there lies a dark chapter that has been minimized or even silenced for years: the mass rapes perpetrated by American soldiers on French soil. The perception of France as an erotic paradise among American soldiers did not emerge spontaneously. Since World War I, veterans' stories of their sexual encounters with French women became legendary. During World War II, these stories were fed and amplified by military propaganda, which presented France and its women as a resource available to American soldiers. In military magazines like Stars and Stripes, France was portrayed as a country where women were beautiful, welcoming, and in many cases easily accessible. This stereotype of an eroticized France deeply ingrained itself in the minds of soldiers who arrived for the invasion with the belief that French women owed them something, even their bodies, as a reward for their sacrifice in the war. The reality, however, was far darker. Just 2 months after the landings, the first reports of sexual violence began to emerge. What initially might have been seen as an isolated case quickly turned into a wave of abuse. The rapes were not committed by soldiers directly engaged in frontline combat, but by those in logistical support units where discipline was looser and soldiers had more free time after their shifts. These men, without the immediate pressure of combat, found in French women a trophy they felt entitled to by right. Testimonies and historical records have revealed the extent of these abuses, although many of these events remained buried for decades. According to historians such as Robert Lilly and Mary Louise Roberts, between 1944 and 1945, U.S. military courts in France tried 139 soldiers for these crimes. Of these, 68 were sentenced to life imprisonment and 22 to death. However, this figure only reflects the officially prosecuted cases, and historians suggest that the actual number of victims could have been much higher, as many women never reported the abuses out of fear of retaliation or the shame and social stigma. The fact that these rapes were not fully known for so long reflects the complexity and silence surrounding the war crimes committed by soldiers of the nation that, in many historical accounts, was seen as Europe's savior. The contradiction is brutal. While millions of American soldiers fought on the front lines to defeat the Nazi regime and liberate oppressed peoples, many of these same men committed acts of sexual abuse in the country they were supposedly liberating. In their research, Lilly and Roberts also highlight how the stigma faced by the victims of these rapes has been minimized, both by French and American societies, contributing to the perpetuation of historical amnesia about these crimes. For many women, being attacked by American soldiers not only meant physical violation, but also an assault on their dignity and autonomy in the context of liberation. While the Allied powers celebrated the fall of the Third Reich, the women who suffered this violence were trapped in a cycle of suffering, without justice or recognition. The silence that surrounded these events for so many decades reveals something deeply disturbing about how historical narratives have been constructed and the voices of victims silenced. Despite attempts to bury these stories in oblivion, it is now known that French women, and particularly the most vulnerable, were victims of a form of sexual violence that was seen as a kind of reward for soldiers who, in some way, thought they were entitled to them. Like the crimes committed by the Nazi regime in concentration camps, the sexual violence during the D-Day invasion highlights a more complex and disturbing reality of war, where ideals of freedom and justice were sometimes accompanied by a dark exploitation of the most vulnerable. The official history of World War II, with its emphasis on liberation and heroism, must be revised to recognize that no one, not even the heroes of war, escaped sin. and the victims of this forgotten chapter continue to fight for their voices to be heard. The Soviet Union and sexual atrocities. The Soviet Union's contribution to the fall of Berlin and the end of the Third Reich was crucial. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army began its westward advance after penetrating East Prussia and Pomerania. When they reached the vicinity of Berlin, the Soviet Army temporarily halted 60 kilometers from the German capital on a defensive line along the Oder River. This would be just the prelude to the final offensive that culminated in the German surrender on May 2, 1945, days after Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. However, as the Soviet troops advanced, the price of victory was paid in a much darker manner. On the road to Berlin and during the occupation of German territory, the sexual atrocities committed by the Red Army were numerous, uncontrollable, and in many cases systematic. Violence against German women was excessive, and the statistics of rapes committed by Soviet soldiers are terrifying. Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, steal, kill, do whatever they wanted. These words were spoken by Lisa Salar, a Protestant woman who served as a teleprinter operator in the German army during the Soviet invasion. Like many other women, she was a victim of the horror unleashed by Soviet soldiers. Lisa, like hundreds of women, was used not only as a tactic of war, but also as a means of punishment and revenge against the German people. Sexual violence, however, was not an isolated incident, but a massive practice, and both Soviet and German military reports, as well as testimonies from soldiers and victims, confirm the magnitude of these crimes. In her account, Lisa Salar describes how Soviet soldiers showed no mercy. They didn't take her out of the basement. They put her against the wall, lined up with their machine guns aimed at us, and raped the woman. Medical testimonies from Berlin hospitals estimated that between 95,000 and 130,000 women were raped in the German capital alone, representing approximately 6% of the female population in the city. This violence did not discriminate by age. Victims ranged from girls as young as 8 years old to women in their 80s. What is even more horrifying is that many of these women were abused multiple times, even by several soldiers in the same day. The horror was systematic and carried out with absolute disregard for the humanity of the victims. During the conflict, at least 860,000 women and girls were raped by Soviet and Allied forces. These numbers are not mere statistics. They reflect a brutality without limits. Although some attempts at justice were made, many of these crimes were insufficiently documented or prosecuted, and the memory of the victims blurred amid the chaos of war. Today, the topic of rapes committed by the Red Army remains a taboo in Russia, an aspect of history that has been consciously avoided. Many Russian media outlets continue to treat allegations of mass sexual violence as Western myths or wartime propaganda. Nevertheless, the testimonies of the victims and reports from the time leave no doubt about the scale of these abuses. The situation of Russian women during the German occupation is also filled with horror. Although details about how they were treated by Soviet troops are less known, many reports suggest that Russian women were victims of systematic violence both in the Nazi-occupied territories and on the Eastern Front itself. In the case of war prisoners and women in occupied territories, sexual violence was one of the most devastating weapons of war. A shocking testimony about the abuse of women during the Soviet invasion in Crimea is a photograph taken by a Nazi soldier showing the body of a young woman on the ground. Her skirt is lifted, her hands cover her face, and the evidence suggests that she was not only murdered, but also raped before her death. This image, which is now exhibited at the German-Russian Museum in Berlin, is a brutal reminder of the sexual atrocities committed not only by the Nazis, but also by the Allied forces on the battlefield. The human cost of war is not only measured in deaths, but also in the suffering of women who were reduced to objects of sexual violence. These crimes must not be forgotten or minimized. In the collective memory of World War II, the sexual atrocities committed by Nazi, Soviet, and American troops must be an integral part of the historical narrative, not only as a reminder of the brutality of war, but also as a call to reflect on the limits of humanity in times of conflict. Rape and killing of Italian women in World War II. War is the closest thing to hell on earth. However, for some Italian women, World War II was even worse. Amid the chaos and brutality of the global conflict, Italian women faced unimaginable cruelty at the hands of invading troops. One of the darkest and least known episodes of this period is what is today referred to as the Moroccanite, a series of mass rapes and killings primarily carried out by the Goumiers, colonial soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps. The Goumiers, mostly composed of Moroccans, were known for their ferocity in combat and their reputation for cruelty towards civilian women. These soldiers, coming from French colonies in North Africa such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia and Senegal, were part of the Allied forces fighting in the Italian peninsula. Under the command of General Alphonse Juin, a veteran military officer with a complex history that included initially serving the Nazis before joining the Allies, the Goumiers played a crucial role in the Battle of Monte Cassino. The Battle of Monte Cassino, also known as the Battle for Rome, was a series of 4 decisive confrontations between February and May of 1944, aimed at liberating the Italian capital from Nazi control. Monte Cassino, located in a mountainous region of the Frosinone province, was a strategic point the Allies needed to capture in order to advance towards Rome. The German forces fiercely defended this position, establishing the Gustav Line on rugged terrain that made any Allied advance difficult. On May 14, 1944, the French army, partly composed of Goumiers, launched an offensive to cross the mountainous terrain and break the German lines. Under explicit orders from General Juin, the Goumiers advanced with unprecedented brutality. Instead of limiting themselves to military combat, these soldiers began looting towns and raping Italian women indiscriminately. In a single night, on May 18, 1944, thousands of Goumiers roamed the slopes of the Chiosiaria Mountains, committing acts of sexual violence and massacres that left a trail of horror and devastation. The Moroccanate not only involved mass rapes, but also brutal tortures and murders of innocent civilians. Women of all ages, from girls to elderly women, were victims of these sadistic attacks. Survivors' testimonies recount scenes of desperation and terror, where women were forced to endure physical and sexual abuse while attempting to protect their families. A heartbreaking example is that of Don Alberto Terilli, a parish priest who tried to save 2 young girls, aged 6 and 9. Instead of being rewarded for his bravery, he was brutally raped in front of the minors, symbolizing the complete dehumanization and cruelty of the aggressors. The brutality of the Goumiers was fueled by a climate of impunity. General Juin had assured them that after winning the battle, they would be the absolute masters of what they found beyond the enemy, guaranteeing that no one would punish them for their actions. This tacit authorization allowed the Goumiers to operate without restrictions, committing atrocities with total indifference to the lives and dignity of Italian women. The impact of the Moroccanate was devastating. In towns such as Esperia, Patrica, Pofi, Isoletta, Supino, and Morolo, hundreds of women were raped and killed in short periods of time. Official figures recognize more than 2,000 women and 600 men as victims, although the actual number may be as high as 60,000 due to cases that were not reported due to stigma and fear. These atrocities left deep scars on the affected communities, with consequences that lasted for generations. Despite the magnitude of the crimes, there was a remarkable lack of accountability. French high commands, including General de Gaulle and Alphonse Juin, never faced consequences for the actions of their troops. France, in its attempt to maintain good international relations and avoid further conflicts, chose to silence these horrific events. The International Red Cross offered assistance, but the Italian government rejected intervention to avoid further straining relations with France, thereby perpetuating a veil of silence over the Moroccanate. The pain and trauma of the victims remained unhealed, and many Italian women suffered in silence for decades. The lack of official recognition and the impunity of the perpetrators contributed to these stories being forgotten, relegated to a dark and marginal chapter in World War II history. It was only in later years, thanks to the work of historians, survivors, and documentaries such as Vittorio De Sica's film La Chiocciara, that these atrocities began to come to light and receive the recognition they deserved. Lack of recognition of sexual violence, a collective amnesia. Sexual violence perpetrated against women during World War II has remained for decades in the shadows of the official history of the conflict. Despite being one of the most devastating experiences for millions of women in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world, this issue remains insufficiently recognized, both in collective memory and in the dominant historical narrative. Shame and silence have played a crucial role in this amnesia, and victims often have not found an adequate space to tell their pain. The lack of attention to these crimes is not only due to the tacit complicity of the society of the time, but also to the political interests of the Allied powers, who were unwilling to acknowledge the atrocities committed by their own soldiers. On all sides of the conflict, rape was used as a tool of terror, control, and humiliation, aimed at stripping women from occupied territories of their dignity. Soldiers, whether German, Soviet, American, or Japanese, committed systematic sexual atrocities against women in the countries they invaded or liberated, and although gender violence was omnipresent, the stories of the victims were widely silenced. The Nazi regime, with its racist and expansionist ideology, considered women from occupied territories, especially in Eastern Europe, as war spoils. The German occupation of the Soviet Union, Poland, and other countries is a clear example of how women were seen as war rewards for the soldiers. Exact figures of rapes committed by German soldiers are difficult to determine, but it is estimated that more than 2 million Soviet women were raped by German troops, many of them in the first months of the German invasion of the USSR. However, these atrocities were not adequately recorded in history, as the official post-war narrative focused on presenting Germany as the sole responsible party for the horrors of the conflict, while rapes and other sexual crimes committed by German soldiers were minimized or ignored. The Red Army, after the Nazi invasion, played a crucial role in the liberation of Eastern Europe, but it was also involved in numerous rapes. After the capture of Berlin in 1945, Soviet troops raped thousands of German women in an act of vengeance for the crimes committed by the Nazis. The rapes were seen by some Soviet soldiers as a rite of conquest, a way to avenge the atrocities suffered by Soviets under the German occupation. The fact that German women were seen as enemies and responsible for the Nazi crimes contributed to the dehumanization of these victims. Despite the magnitude of these atrocities, the Soviet narrative and the official post-war memory never significantly acknowledged these sexual crimes. American soldiers were also responsible for sexual crimes during World War II, although the official history has tended to minimize or justify these events in many cases. During the occupation of Germany, Italy, and Japan, numerous cases of rapes were reported, both against German and Japanese women, often perpetrated by young soldiers in a context of disorganization and chaos in the occupied zones. In Italy, women were subjected to sexual abuse during the Allied Liberation Campaign in 1943 to 1944, and in Japan, thousands of women were forced to work as sex slaves in what is known as comfort women, a euphemism for the sexual slavery imposed by the Japanese army. The treatment of these rapes has largely been ignored in the official narratives of the Allied countries. While emphasis was placed on the great achievements and justice of the liberation, the suffering of women whose only guilt was being in the path of victorious soldiers was overlooked. Women in occupied countries, whether in Europe or Asia, were seen as war booty, and their voices were silenced by the culture of victory and heroism. The official history of World War II, as constructed by the victors, primarily focused on the heroic aspects of the conflict, such as battles, strategies, and victories. Stories of suffering, especially those that didn't fit the good guys and villains narrative, were minimized. Victims of sexual violence, in particular, were made invisible. The shame and stigma surrounding sexual violence at the time made it impossible for many women to speak about what they had suffered, while the trauma of many others was completely ignored by society and by official historiography. On the other hand, the context of the Cold War and the rivalry between Western powers and the Soviet Union also contributed to maintaining silence about the sexual violence committed by the Allies. Acknowledging these crimes would have challenged the image of the Allies as just and heroic liberators, which would have had negative diplomatic consequences in the post-war period. Moreover, the political interests of the great powers, who needed cohesion in their respective spheres of influence, disincentivized opening up this type of debate.